Hello, welcome back. Today's topic is about Bahire Hasab, an astronomic calendar. Bahire Hasab, an astronomic calendar. 6 Medeb. Now we enter the important 19-year lunar cycle. Take Amathalum divided by 19. The remainder is called Medeb. For 2019 EC, 7,519 divided by 19. 19 times 395 equals 7,505, 7,519, 7,505 equals 14. Therefore, Medeb equals 14. This 19-year cycle is important because the lunar and solar calendars don't have exactly the same length. 7 Wenber is derived from Medeb. Wenber equals Medeb. 1 hashtag. So for 2019, 14 1 equals 13. Therefore, Wenber equals 13. There is a special rule: when Medeb is 0, Wenber becomes 18. 8 Abet. Now we get to the lunar calculation. Abet represents the accumulated difference/age of the moon within the calendar cycle. The calculation is Abet equals remainder of Wenber times 11 divided by 30 for 2019. 13 times 11 equals 143. Number 143 divided by 30. Number 30 times 4 equals 120. Number 143 120 equals 23. Therefore, Abet equals 23. The traditional system uses 30 as the basic month/day unit in this calculation. 9 Mitai is closely related to Abet. Calculation: Mitai equals remainder of Wenber times 19 divided by 30 for 2019. 13 times 19 equals 247. Hashtag 247 divided by 30. 30 times 8 equals 240. Number 247 240 equals 7. Therefore, Mitai equals 7. And notice, Abet plus Mitai equals 23 plus 7 equals 30. This relationship is a key part of the system. 10 What does Mitai actually mean? This is where the calculation becomes practical. Mitai identifies the traditional date associated with the lunar conjunction/new moon calculation used in determining the liturgical year. The system then determines whether the Mitai falls in Mescarum or Tikimd, depending on its value. For example, Mitai 14 rightward arrow associated with Mescarum, Mitai less than or equal to 14 rightward arrow associated with Tikimd. The exact weekday and subsequent calculations then lead toward the determination of Nineveh, and ultimately Easter. 11 From Mitai to Nineveh. This is one of the most interesting parts. The Ethiopian Orthodox system doesn't simply say, Easter equals a particular Gregorian day. Instead, it establishes a sequence. A simplified chain is, year downward arrow Amathalum downward arrow Medeb downward arrow Wenber downward arrow Abet plus Mitai downward arrow Baal Mitai downward arrow Tuzak downward arrow Mevaja Hamer downward arrow Nanu downward arrow Lent downward arrow Palm Sunday downward arrow Good Friday downward arrow Pascha. The calculations therefore connect the astronomical/lunar cycle to the liturgical calendar. 12 Why Nanu is important. Nanu is the fast of Nineveh. It is a 3-day fast, beginning on Monday. In the Bahire Hasab system, once the date of Nanu is established, the dates of many other movable observances can be derived. For example, the traditional sequence includes approximately Nanu rightward arrow 14 days, rightward arrow Aviixum/Great Lent, rightward arrow de Berzai, rightward arrow Hosanna/Palm Sunday, rightward arrow Seeklet/Good Friday, rightward arrow Pascha/Easter. One published description gives the offsets as Aviixum, plus 14 days de Berzai, plus 41 Hosanna, plus 62 Seeklet, plus 67 Pascha, plus 69. This is why knowing one correctly calculated point allows you to establish many other dates. 13 The 19-year cycle. Why 19? Because the solar year and lunar year are different lengths. A solar year is roughly 365 1/4 days, while a lunar year of 12 lunar months is roughly 354 days, so there is a difference of roughly 11 days per year. After several years, that difference becomes large. The traditional calendar system therefore uses a 19-year cycle, commonly associated with the Metinic cycle, to reconcile the lunar and solar patterns. This is the mathematical foundation behind Abet and Mitai. 14 The 28-year cycle. There is also a 28-year cycle. This relates to the weekday/solar cycle. The important idea is that the relationship between year plus weekday plus leap year structure eventually repeats. The Ethiopian calendrical tradition combines the 19-year lunar cycle with the 28-year cycle. 19 times 28 equals 532. Therefore, 532 years equals grand cycle. This is called the 532-year cycle or Auta QMR in discussions of the traditional system. 15 Why 532 years is important. The 532-year cycle is especially important for calculating movable feasts. Once the complete pattern for the 532-year cycle is established, the corresponding pattern can repeat. So conceptually, 19-year lunar cycle times 28-year solar/weekday cycle equals 532-year grand cycle. This is one of the most beautiful mathematical features of the Ethiopian computus. 16 Is this astronomy? Yes, but we should be precise. Bahire Hasab is traditional calendrical astronomy, rather than modern observational astronomy. It incorporates concepts concerning 1. The sun 2. Moon 3. Lunar months 4. Solar years 5. Weekdays 6. Season 7. Recurring astronomical/calendar cycles. Historical Ethiopian calendrical manuscripts also describe the sun's annual movement and seasonal divisions. A recent scholarly study of the Abushakir manuscript, for example, describes solar and lunar cycles and the relationship between the sun, months, and seasons. 17. Abushakir versus Bahire Hasab. The names can be confusing. You may see Bahire Hasab, Abushakir/Abushahir, Bahire Hasab, Abushakir. They are not simply three completely separate calendars. Bahire Hasab is the calendrical computation tradition/system, while Abushakir refers to a major textual/source tradition associated with the system. Historical scholarship describes the system as being refined in the medieval period and refers to the Ethiopian tradition of Bahire Hasab Abushakir. So if someone says Abushahir calendar, they may be referring to the Abushakir/Bahire Hasab system, rather than a separate 13-month calendar. 18. The whole system in one diagram. Think of it this way. Sun solar cycle downward arrow, Ethiopian year downward arrow, Amadalam downward arrow, Medeb/19 downward arrow, Wenber/ downward arrow, Abet / downward arrow, Mitai / downward arrow, lunar calculation downward arrow, Baal Mitai downward arrow, Tuzak downward arrow, Mebaja Hamer downward arrow, Nunuk fast downward arrow, Great Lent downward arrow, other fasts. Downward arrow, Hosanna downward arrow, Sikla downward arrow, Basicus/Easter. The 19-year lunar cycle and 28-year weekday/solar cycle then combine into the larger 19 times 28 equals 532-year cycle. A complete worked example for 2019 EC, using the traditional calculations above. 2019 plus 5,500 equals 7,519. 7,519 divided by 4 rightward arrow, remainder 3 rightward arrow, Luke 7,519 divided by 19 rightward arrow, remainder 14 rightward arrow, Medeb 14 1 equals 13 rightward arrow, Wenber 13 times 11 equals 143 rightward arrow, remainder 23 rightward arrow, Abet 13 times 19 equals 247 rightward arrow, remainder 7 rightward arrow, Mitai 7. So the beginning of the calculation is 2019 EC rightward arrow 7,519 Amadalam rightward arrow, Luke rightward arrow, Medeb 14 rightward arrow, Wenber 13 rightward arrow, Abet 23 rightward arrow, Mitai 7. From there, the traditional calculations continue through Baal Mitai rightward arrow, Tuzak rightward arrow, Mebaja Hamer rightward arrow, Nunu rightward arrow, Lent rightward arrow, Basica. If you want to actually learn how to calculate it by hand, the next useful step is to take 2019 EC and calculate Nunuk, Abiyitzim, Hosanna, Sikla, and Basica one by one, including a weekday arithmetic. That is where Bahire Hasab becomes much easier to understand. Get smarter responses, upload files, and images, and more. Yes. Let's go much deeper, but I'll separate the concepts carefully because Ethiopian calendar, Bahire Hasab, and Abushakir/Abushahir are related but not identical. A manuscript catalogued by the Institute of Ethiopian Studies at Addis Ababa University actually describes Brat Asib as computus/C of computation, showing that this was treated as a mathematical/calendrical work. Modern scholarship also identifies Bahire Hasab and Abushakir as alternative names associated with the manuscript tradition, whose contents include astronomy, mathematics, calendars, and chronology. 1. The big picture. Think of the traditional system as several layers. Time sun solar year. Moon lunar month luni solar system downward arrow Bahire Hasab downward arrow civil dates church dates astronomical 13 months fasting feasts downward arrow Basica. Calculations. The important idea is that the system tries to reconcile solar time and lunar time through repeating numerical cycles. The Abushakir manuscript tradition explicitly discusses the sun, moon, stars, seasons, time units, and 7 cycles of time. 2. First, what exactly is the Ethiopian calendar? The ordinary Ethiopian calendar is a solar calendar with 13 months. 12 months each has exactly 30 days, so 12 times 30 equals 360 days. Then, Hageman normally, 5 days leap year, 6 days. Therefore 360 plus 5 equals 365, or 360 plus 6 equals 366. This is one of the most distinctive features of the Ethiopian calendar. The Abushakir manuscript also describes 12 months of 30 days plus a 13th month of 5 or 6 days. 3. But why do we need Bahire Hasab if the calendar is solar? This is the key question. For ordinary civil dates, you don't need complicated Bahire Hasab calculations. For example, Mescharim 1 is the beginning of the Ethiopian year. but the Ethiopian Orthodox liturgical calendar contains events whose dates move from year to year. Particularly, Nineveh Avidzim / Great Lent Deberzite Hosanna Seclet / Good Friday Tinsy / Easter Ascension Pentecost. These depend on the traditional lunar / solar computus. So, Ethiopian civil calendar equals tells you what day / month / year it is. Bahire Hasab equals provides calculations used to establish the movable liturgical calendar. See you soon.